All right, guys, so today I need to tackle something that's been on my to-do list for at least a year now, and that is reclaiming my garage. So I don't know what it is, but our garage always seems to get like this, and I'm honestly a little bit embarrassed to show you guys how it looks right now, but let's go ahead and rip off the Band-Aid and show you what I'm working with. So needless to say, it is pretty bad in here. It is the worst it's ever been, in fact. And I think that's because of a few reasons. First and foremost, building the tiny house meant that I ended up with a lot of extra building materials and new tools that just didn't have a home. So things have been piling up here in the garage, and because my new shop has not been finished, I didn't want to bring a bunch of this clutter over there just to be in my way while I was renovating that space. The other big thing that needs to change in here is I'm gonna get rid of this big garage workbench I built. It's an awesome workbench, but it is just way too big for our garage, especially now that the new shop is set up. I'm just not working over here that much. And so instead of having a big 4x8 workbench taking up the entire middle of the garage space, I'm gonna be building a miter saw station against this sidewall, so that way everything can stay tucked out of the way. I'm not gonna add a traditional fence system to the miter saw, so that way each side of the miter saw station will still function as a workbench. And I think overall that's just gonna be a lot better setup. Besides swapping the workbench for a miter saw station, I also want to reconfigure some of this wall storage because there's just a lot of wasted space in here. And really, that's the big thing we need in here is storage, obviously. We've got 2 kids. There's lots of kids stuff that goes along with that. We have lots of bikes, and we're getting more and more bikes as the kids get older and get into biking. So a lot of that storage stuff needs to be dealt with. First and foremost, though, I need to get this garage decluttered. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So now that the garage is finally cleaned up, and as you might have seen in my last video, I went ahead and built the miter saw station as well. I want to go ahead and tackle the wall storage, which is going to be one of the big components of this kind of garage storage system. So as you guys have seen, I've been using this Craftsman VersaTrack system for quite a while, and it works really well, but I want to change it up because I found something out about it, and that's that you can mount a section of pegboard between 2 rows of this VersaTrack without any additional mounting hardware, and I think that's going to work out really nicely to have a row of VersaTrack at the top and bottom and a section of pegboard in the middle for some of the kind of smaller stuff. But first I need to go ahead and get everything cleaned off of the VersaTrack system that's there now. Go ahead and get the bottom row removed, and then I can start getting the pegboard mounted. So after getting all the tools cleaned off and getting that lower row of VersaTrack taken down, I could go ahead and start getting everything mounted in its new position. And so basically the upper row was staying where it was. It seemed like a pretty good location. And so now I just needed to figure out where I needed to mount that lower row. And so as I mentioned, pegboard fits into this VersaTrack. It's a pretty cool idea, actually. As you can see on the edge of this VersaTrack, there's this little groove in the bottom. The pegboard just sits in like that, and then on the top edge just kind of tucks into that rabbet like that. But that allows you to have a nice section of pegboard between 2 rows of VersaTrack, as you see here. I've already done this work, and I think by combining these 2 systems you can hang a lot of heavier stuff from the VersaTrack, because I think that's really one weakness of pegboard. You don't want to hang super heavy stuff from it because it really is just kind of compressed sawdust at the end of the day. But then you can hang lighter stuff, you know, your smaller measuring tools and all that kind of stuff on the pegboard section in the middle, and I think get a really nice kind of combination here. So I was going to try to measure out exactly where the bottom row was going to go, but I figured it would probably be best just to hold the section of pegboard in place while I mounted the bottom row, but that was definitely easier said than done. This is an 8-foot long by 2-foot wide section of pegboard, so it was pretty heavy. Keeping it in the groove was a little bit difficult by myself, but I basically just tacked one piece of VersaTrack in place to kind of hold it in position, and then got everything nice and snug and put a second piece in place, lined up with the studs exactly where I needed it. Then I could remove that other piece and put the final piece in there to get this first kind of 8-foot section in place. And I didn't have anything to work around on this first section, so that made it super easy to install. But on the second section, I had 2 outlets to contend with, so I needed to notch out both the VersaTrack as well as the pegboard because of where the outlet ended up. That was pretty easy though. I just marked out the location where I needed to cut, leaving a little bit of wiggle room, and then cut it with a jigsaw here at the workbench. And I am loving having this T-track here in this miter saw station. This is really exactly how I envisioned it. I can use this as a workbench because there's no traditional kind of miter saw fence. I just have this nice big flat area, and this Rockler T-track system just works awesome. I got the piece of VersaTrack notched out, but then I also needed to cut this section of pegboard to length because I was going to butt into my electrical panel here. So I did that with the miter saw, just made a cut, flipped it over and finished the cut, and then also went ahead and notched out the pegboard itself to fit around that outlet. And again, I did have 2 outlets to contend with, so it was a little bit tricky. Once all that was done though, I could go ahead and get the pegboard and VersaTrack mounted in place. And again, this was pretty awkward, especially because the miter saw was in the way, but eventually I got it done. Just made sure to run screws through the VersaTrack into the studs to make sure everything was super strong. And once that was done, the pegboard and VersaTrack wall was installed. Once the storage wall was installed, I could finally start getting things organized on here, which was really exciting because after taking everything off of this wall, the garage was super cluttered, and it's always so satisfying to organize a new storage wall like this, kind of figure out what tools you want to group together, and also just figure out what you want to hang on the wall, because obviously this is going to be for the things that are most often used here in the garage shop. It was super simple to hang all of my power tools on the VersaTrack system because the drill and impact drivers have this little hook that integrates with the VersaTrack. Got a lot of my measuring tools hung up, a couple speed squares, a combination square. Also set up a section for all my PPE, as well as a spot to hold a couple of tape measures because those are always just getting put down in random places in the garage. I also got my little crafted workshop sign mounted here. I put it right behind the miter saw because with the miter saw in the way, I didn't really want to hang a bunch of stuff there because it's not as easy to get to. So I figured that'd be the perfect place for my sign. Also, since I got rid of my old drill charging station, I needed to find a home for all of my drill and impact driver bits, as well as the chargers, and I just wall mounted the chargers. The Craftsman chargers hang on the VersaTrack, and then I put all the bits in a drawer. And I actually think it's nice not to have a drill charging station on this kind of setup because it would have taken up a lot of the depth above the workbench, and I think that just would have gotten in the way. So I think having everything kind of nice and flat against the wall just makes more sense for here. I also got an assortment of clamps and levels hung up, and I think once that was done, the storage wall was looking pretty dang good. And the beauty of this setup is it can kind of evolve over time. Pegboard and VersaTrack are both very versatile. It's easy to move tools around, and I have a bunch of extra hanging accessories. So with this storage wall pretty much wrapped up, let's move to another area that needs to be addressed, and that is our bike storage. If you guys have been subscribed to the channel for a while, you might remember when I built the DIY bike rack storage system at our previous house, and up until now it had been working pretty well. It's definitely a super inexpensive system, so if you're just looking for the most budget-friendly option, that system is pretty hard to beat. But it was becoming a little bit difficult to use because one, we have quite a few bikes here, and two, I have recently converted to an e-bike, and this thing is just incredibly heavy. So having to lift the bike up and trying to get it on and off that hanging hook was just kind of annoying, and I just didn't want to have to deal with that anymore, and so I wanted a new system. And what I went with was this steady rack system. And so these things are super cool. You basically just roll your bike up to the wall. The little tray that kind of holds the wheel takes the wheel and lifts it up all in one motion based on the kind of mechanism of the rack itself. And then once it's on the wall, you can swivel the bikes so that you can have a little bit more room to get whatever bike you want on and off without having the other bikes in the way. Installing the steady racks is a pretty straightforward process. You basically just take the rack out of the box, go ahead and open it to its fully open position, and then sit your bike on the ground with the back wheel against the wall you'll be mounting it on. And the distance the steady rack ends up off of the wall in this kind of setup is pretty much where you want to mount it on the wall, give or take. Steady Rack recommends adding a few extra inches to the height depending on the exact bike. Another thing to consider is where your handlebars are going to end up, because you don't want your handlebars to bump into each other. That just makes it much more annoying to get bikes on and off, so you might want to stagger the racks even more than that if you have a few bikes that are very similar in the wheelbase and kind of handlebar positions. But once I figured out the exact height I wanted the steady rack, all I needed to do was pre-drill a couple holes into the studs in that location on the wall, and then I could drive in the included mounting bolts, and these things are super beefy. I'm pretty sure you could hang a human being off of these steady racks, so I don't think a bike is going to pose any sort of problems with the weight. Even my like 45-pound e-bike, I don't think it's going to be any issue. The steady rack system also includes a little holder for your back tire so that you don't get tire marks all over your wall, which it's too late for that in our case. We've got plenty of tire marks on the wall, but it's a garage. I don't really care. But that is a pretty nice part of the system, and it also keeps the bike in place better when you're swiveling it left to right. Once I had one bike done, I could just rinse and repeat for the rest of our bikes, and we have one road bike. I have two mountain bikes, a hardtail and an e-bike, and then my wife has a full suspension mountain bike, so I get all those mounted. I do wish I had staggered the heights a little bit more because my handlebars on my e-bike and my wife's mountain bike tend to run into each other, but again, that kind of awesome feature of being able to swivel your bikes means that even with the handlebars pretty close to each other, if I swivel the bike out of the way, it's still really easy to get it on and off the wall. The last thing to hang up was the little kind of bike storage cabinet where I keep all of my bike tools and gloves and extra chains and all that kind of stuff. Anything that I might need to maintenance these bikes lives on that little cabinet, and that's just hung up with a French cleat. And again, I built that as part of that kind of DIY bike rack video previously. The last thing I wanted to figure out how to do was hang up my son's bike. He rides a 16-inch wheel Cervelo bike. He's 5 years old, so it's a pretty small bike, and none of these steady racks will work with a 16-inch wheel. You need at least a 20-inch wheel to work with the steady rack stuff. But in the meantime, I just added one of the hooks I was using on the old bike rack to the underside of this little bike storage cabinet, and that way we can just hang his bike directly under that, and he can even get it on and off of there by himself. Good job, bud.
Yeah, pretty cool.
The next thing I wanted to do was work on this back wall, which was another area that just kind of tends to accumulate clutter. And this was really mostly just reorganizing things. I decided to move my compressor over into this little spot I ended up with in my miter saw station I had built. And I think that'll be the perfect spot to have the compressor. It's closer to the front of the garage. I also mounted my hose reel there on one of the legs of the miter saw station, and that'll work really nicely in this spot, a little bit easier to access than on this back wall. I also got my electric skateboards organized, and these things hang perfectly on this VersaTrack system. I have them set up next to an outlet so that I can charge them while they're hanging on the wall and they're ready to go at any time. After that was done, I just kept kind of shuffling things around on the back wall here. And one thing I've been trying to figure out a spot for is my Craig ACS track saw table system. And I think I'm actually going to move this thing over to my shop because I think it'll get a lot more use there. And moving the ACS out of the way freed up a lot of space on this back wall so I could get the rest of this stuff, my extension cords, sawhorses, all that kind of stuff, tidied up. And I think overall this back wall turned out great. So I think this whole garage project turned out awesome. Everything is looking so much better, and hopefully with all of these new storage systems in place, we can avoid the garage becoming that cluttered mess that it was at the beginning of this video. If you guys are interested in checking out any of the products or tools I showed in the video, I'll have those linked in the video description below. Also, if it's your first time here, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell so you don't miss my future videos. And last, if you want to support me, I have merch available, I have plans for a lot of my woodworking projects, and I have both Patreon and YouTube members set up. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.